Hi there, I'm Dr. Samuel Mitchum, the Heritage Operations Historian for the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I thought y'all might enjoy hearing some war stories. They come from my book, Voices from the Confederacy, which was written just for fun, and it's, like I say, just war stories. There's some interesting ones. There were some close escapes in this war. One of my favorites was Lieutenant Richard Walsh. He was in that Missouri battery that did so well with General Bowen in the Vicksburg campaigns. In the Battle of Grand Gulf, he had a rather miraculous escape. Now, Walsh is one of those guys who, when they stand up, he spread his feet far apart. Um, Most people, of course, have their feet close together, but not him. And while he was standing watching the Union fleet attempt to take Grand Gulf, one of them fired a heavy artillery shell which went right between his legs. It tore his pants on both legs, gave him flesh wounds on both legs, but he was not seriously wounded. But he had a huge artillery shell go right between his legs, and it lodged right behind him and did not explode. So he was doubly lucky. If it had gone a couple of inches either way, it would have torn off a leg. And if it had exploded, they wouldn't have found much of him to bury. History does not record if he was able to finish the battle, but I seriously doubt it. He was probably in a state of shock. But he did continue and did very well and survived the war. Another one, the women are underestimated when you talk about the Confederacy, and I do several chapters on them. One of my favorites was Mary Robinson. She was a 21-year-old widow. Her husband had died in the Confederate Army, and she was far away from home when the Union soldiers captured her and accused her of being a spy, which she was. But they didn't really have enough to convict her, so they took her to their colonel, and he accused her. And she had an alibi. Why were you so far away from home? Well, I was trying to find my brother's horse, which you Yankees stole. The colonel didn't really believe her, but again, he couldn't prove it. He said he was going to take her to Jacksonport and incarcerate her. And she said, the only way you will do that is if you tie me up, bind me hand and foot, and drag me to Jacksonport. Well, the colonel didn't want to do that. So he asked her, well, will you take an oath that you will not aid the Confederacy? And she said, yes, if that's the only way to get away from you, I will. And he said, will you honor the oath? And she said, I most certainly will not. It won't be worth the snap of my fingers as soon as you are out of sight. So he didn't know what to do, so he finally just had the men take her home. And she escaped and, was never convicted as a spy. There were a lot of problems, especially late in the war, with food. As the war wore on, they became more and more scarce. Of course, Vicksburg, they were selling rats in the public meat market for $3.50. The average Confederate soldier, private at that time, was paid $11 a month. So if you can imagine paying a week of your wages to eat one rat, you have an idea how hungry they were. It wasn't quite that bad in Petersburg, but it was still pretty miserable. The standard diet was peas, bread, and sorghums. And the bread, of course, was hardtack. It was monotonous. There wasn't enough salt. There wasn't enough food. In fact, the children would go out where the Confederate cavalry was and pick up grain that they were feeding the horses that just spilled on the ground. That's how hungry they were. General Pryor's son, Theo, became ill, and the doctors prescribed for him an extra ration from the hospital of 1 pint of soup per day. And one day he actually found a chicken drumstick in his soup, and he was ecstatic. And he finally told his mother he hoped he didn't get well. And she was shocked. She said, what, do you want to die? He said, well, no, I don't want to die, but if I get well, they'll take away my soup ration. That's how hungry they were. The bacon, occasionally they got bacon, but the bacon was of extremely poor quality. Salt was virtually unavailable. It was very expensive, so they couldn't preserve the bacon. And many times it was rancid. In fact, there was a joke in the Confederate Army. They said, our bacon outranks General Lee. There was a challenge, too, with rats. Phoebe Pender was the matron of the major hospital there in Richmond, the Chimborazo Hospital. And she talked about how the rats became keener in intelligence as they became hungrier. It sharpened their mental faculties, and they were able to get into more things because they were smarter than they were before the war. There was one big gray rat in particular she was out to get because it would eat nothing but butter. Now, butter at that time cost $20 a pound in Confederate money. The average Confederate private in 1864 was paid $18 a month. So it was a serious matter that this rat was eating the butter. But he outwitted her up until the point she decided to put a fish hook in his favorite brand of butter. And that's when she got rid of the big gray rat. Petersburg was never so healthy as it was in 1864. Prior to that, there was no public garbage pickup anywhere in the United States or the Confederate States of America. And the excess food, spoiled food, was simply thrown on the street. Well, as the siege of Petersburg continued, there wasn't any spoiled food. It was all eaten. The rats and the mice were eaten by the cats and occasionally by the humans until they were gone, and then all the cats were starving, but the streets were clean. The whole South was in a diet by this time. The Confederate horses, it was a major factor, I think, in the defeat of the Confederate cavalry in the Eastern Front. It's not usually appreciated, but the Confederate horses were worn out because they got 2 to 3 pounds of forage per day. The average Union horse got 22 to 23 pounds of forage or grain per day. So the Confederate horses were basically starved, and they simply could not perform anymore at the level that they did in 1862 or 63. The food was a major factor in the defeat of the Confederacy. I'll tell a story about a Union private. Grant lost more men in the Overland Campaign against Robert E. Lee than Lee had in his whole army when it began. And this particular private had just about enough of Ulysses S. Grant. So he went to his captain and said, we need to end this war. We have lost enough men. We've killed enough men. This war needs to cease. And the captain said, well, how do we end the war? He said, we take Richmond. And he said, well, how do you think we do that? He said, I know how to do that. Said, well, how do you do that? And the private responded, we swap generals. But anyway, those are just a few of the little war stories. Invoices from the Confederacy. The whole thing is just one war story after another, and I think you'll enjoy it. We cover the slaves, we cover the women, and certainly the Confederate privates. I told a story once, I'll do it again, we'll end with this, but I think it's my favorite Civil War story. It was about Ida Lee Adkins. She was an African American. Contrary to what you see on Hollywood, the slaves did not hate their masters. They weren't pro-slavery by any means, but it didn't the hatred for slavery didn't translate to the individual white people. Ida May, Ida Lee liked her master. He would go to Raleigh about 2 or 3 times a year, and he'd always get her gumdrops or hard rock candy or something like that. Ida Lee had a sweet tooth. She didn't think much of her Ole Miss, the woman that ran the plantation, was called the Ole Miss. It didn't matter if she's 18 years old or not. As a matter of fact, that's a lot of people think that's where Ole Miss University got its name from, was this incredibly capable woman. And Ida Lee would try to steal sugar cubes when they had sugar. And she thought the Ole Miss had eyes in the back of her head. She'd always catch her. And there was probably a spanking involved because this whole generation believed in spare the rod and spoil the child. Well, when Ida Lee was 8 years old, the Yankees came. The master had an old musket. He fired a shot at him and missed. Probably good for him. They captured him, tied him up, and started looting the plantation. They would put pillowcases and put silverware in it and candlesticks, and they were taking everything. And Ida Lee knew if they got into the storehouse, there wouldn't be anything left to eat after they left. They would all be in danger of starvation. In fact, according to James Downs, Sick from Hunger, at least 80,000 African Americans starved to death after Sherman left, along with 50,000 whites, and he thinks that's the minimum possible figure. Well, Ida Lee, like I said, realized this was a threat. She tried to cut the master loose. A Union soldier saw her and said, "Come here, you black alligator," or words to that effect. "I'm going to cut your tongue out." Well, she took out off the back, which is probably what the soldier meant for her to do. And she thought very rapidly. By this point in the war, there was no sugar in North Carolina, so that everything was sweetened with watermelon juice or honey. Well, they had bee gums or bee boxes by the side of the house, and she knocked them over and stirred up the bees with a stick. She said, until I could smell the poison. She got these bees really mad. And then she took off right in the middle of a Union cavalry troop. Now, some of the Yankees were busy looting. Others had just dismounted and were holding the horses. And still others were just sitting on the horses. Well, she ran right in the middle of this, and the bees followed her and started stinging Yankees and horses. And the horses started throwing Yankees high into the air. And they were cursing and screaming. And, of course, as Ida Lee said, what does a bee care if you curse it? And she took off the other way, and the horses broke free and ran off. Some of them still had Yankees on board. Others were being chased by the Yankees. And she said the Yankees some of them ran faster than the horses. And, of course, the Yankees who were looting dropped their pillowcases and started trying to fight off bees, and then they ran away, pursued by angry bees. So this was a unique event in the American Civil War. 8-year-old African-American girls are not supposed to be able to rout entire troops of Union cavalry, but she did. And they came in, cut the master free, and the Ole Miss said, "Ida Lee, you have saved us all." And she took a gold ring from her own finger and put it on Ida Lee's finger. And when the Federal writers interviewed Ida Lee in 1938, she still had that ring on her finger. It was her prized possession. You know, given the poverty of the New South and the Reconstruction eras, that was probably the only piece of jewelry she had in her whole life. She was very proud of it, even in her 80s. Anyway, that's there's the book, Voices from the Confederacy, if you ever get a chance to pick it up.